Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I apologize for starting the meeting a couple minutes later than I should have. There was an ongoing office hour. So, how are you guys? Hope you all are doing great. Um, yeah, I hope you all are doing great. Well, today, thought to just first off briefly go through the resources, well, not all the materials, but just the major topics for this week. I see that some of you have started to, quite a number of people have actually submitted tasks, submission. I mean, quite a number of people have made submissions for week three's tasks. So that's a good sign. Hopefully this task isn't confusing, as you all said week two's task was. And thank you, I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. Okay, so first off, the task is about functions, right? It's about functions. We already went through collections in week two, unknowing to us, while going through the different kind of data types that exist in that. We went through lists, went through lists, went through maps, which are all part of collections. And you're free to explore. So another thing for this week is functions. I already, in previous office hours, we went through functions. I mean, not like we went through them, but I made use of functions while giving certain examples, right? So functions shouldn't be new to functions shouldn't be new to us right now, because we have indeed gone through we've used them as an example. Let me quickly share my screen so we could just oh yeah, there is also, before we start that, there's something about the task that you all should note. And that is, even though the okay, it's not for this task, it's for the task from next week, where you all were talking about using .io and whatnot. We're going to cover that next week. I thought it relates to this week's task, but it doesn't. So we're not going to talk about that right now. So yeah, let's just very briefly go through functions. And yeah. Let me quickly find the tab and share. Okay, so here I already created a new pad, just so that we could go through yeah, anyway. So Sorry, there seems to be something wrong with. Okay, it's all good now. So yeah, functions. We see the start point of Flutter or Dart code. I remember mentioning that this is a starting point, the main method. This on its own is a function. This is an example of a function. And then we could define functions in different ways. There are functions that are expected to return values. There are some that do not return any value. And we get to, what's the word? We get to declare them in different ways. So for example, when we declare a function using the void keyword, excuse me, when we declare a function using the void keyword, ideally this function, we're expecting it not to return any value. This function returns no value when it's called. Say we want to, an example is to print my name. It's just a sample function. So when you're creating a function, you ideally you assign it some either you assign it as a void or with a data type, which we're going to cover as we go on. But there is a keyword, right? It starts with the keyword, then the name of the function, followed by parentheses, and then it ends with a with curly braces, with two curly braces. The end of a function doesn't require a semicolon. It's not expected when you're declaring a function like this. It's the content of your function. Say you want to actually print my name, which is Abbie. At the end of this statement, then you're expected to add a, sorry, not a colon, a semicolon, right? You're supposed to add a semicolon at the end of the individual statements that are inside of the function. Else, well, there's going to be an error, just as if you were to just write this outside of the function. So you need to always close it with the statements, and this shows that this is the end of this code you've written, and then you go to the next line or whichever, and you write the next thing you want your function to do. So this is pretty much what the function is about, where you have the name of the function, the parentheses, curly brackets, then whatever you want this function to do, you get to put it in between the curly brackets, right? Now, I'm going to explain the purpose of parentheses much later, but for now, this is just a very simple function, right? Now, inside this function, because it's doing just one thing, there's just one action that we want to take inside of this function. So we can declare it in a different way. Instead of using curly brackets, we can use, we can turn this into an anonymous function by declaring it with the equal to and a right angle bracket. This is a short form. It makes the code shorter, and it's clear that the only thing that this function is expected to do is to print my name. And that's the end of the function. But if we're to print multiple things, or if we're to do multiple things inside of the function, then we'll have to convert this into a block by using curly brackets. But in the case where it's just doing one thing, we could just shorten it this way, and we'll pretty much have, we'll not call the function. And we'll pretty much have the same results. This is just a shorter, this is just a shorter form, and it makes reading your code a lot easier, right? Now, the purpose of parentheses is so that our functions can take in arguments, parameters, whichever word you would like to use for this. But parentheses take in arguments for our function. Say, for example, our new function name is to print a name, right? We don't know what name is going to, we want to be able to accept inputs or to accept arguments and then print whatever is given inside of, print whatever is given as an argument inside of our function. So what we can do here is to give it an argument, and whatever argument is given, that is what we want to print. We see here that it's showing an error because one positional argument is expected, but 0 is found. It's expecting an argument as we have declared here. So when we pass in a string, for example, when we pass in a string, we see that the error goes away because that is what it's expecting. This is just as though when we talked about declaring a variable, we said whatever data type you assign, whatever data type you give to your variable, that is what it's expected to give. And that's what it's expecting to receive, rather. So if I were to say 10 here, it's going to throw an error because it's expecting a string and not an integer. So you assign it a string and our problem is solved. And when we run the code, we expect to see Abbie in the console, because that's the variable, that's the value that we assign to this. If we switch this up to Sheyi, we're expecting to see Sheyi in the console, right? Now, our function can take in as many parameters as is required of the function. We could pass in thousands, but of course, why would you want your function to have thousands of parameters? But we could pass in as many parameters as we want to make our function behave the way we want it to behave. So yeah, I could pass in multiple things here by separating each of the arguments with a comma. Could pass in, say I want maybe the age of the person. So print details. Because I have given this an extra parameter, this is throwing an error because it's expecting, because it's expecting 2 arguments, but I assigned it just 1. So that's the reason why it's throwing this error. So if I were to assign a value to this second argument, I would also separate this with a comma and then give it a value of 50 or whichever value you want to pass in. So we see that it satisfies it because it's expecting an int. Now there's something you should note here, and that is, this is called arguments with just parentheses are positional. And when you say positional, it means whatever is in the first position or whatever is in the second position, any value you're assigning to it has to meet the requirements for each of these arguments in their different positions. Just because we have an int here, we have a string, does not mean that we can just switch it up and have Sheyi here. It's going to throw an error because we're assigning int to a string or assigning a string to an int. So it's positional and it's expecting whatever value you pass into this function to follow the exact same way that it was declared. So let's just undo that, and this should solve our problem. So you have to pass in the value the exact same way that you declared your function. Another way in which we could, since we're taking in multiple parameters, let's just have prints for both of them. So this is one way in which we can add arguments to our functions. Let me just check the comments to be sure that everyone is following. Okay. Parameter arguments, they're the same thing. I just gave, I just thought to use the multiple words that you might see it being referred to in maybe articles or videos or whichever. They're pretty much the same thing. Okay. So this is one way in which we can pass in arguments to our functions. Another way in which we can do this is to add curly brackets inside of the parentheses and then give it our arguments. Now, the difference between this is curly brackets make our arguments optional. That is, we can choose to pass in the values or we can choose to not, right? So curly brackets make these arguments, as opposed to when we didn't have curly brackets, you see that it is mandatory. If I were to take out this argument, it's going to throw an error that it's expecting arguments, but we have not given it any. So they're positional, but they're mandatory. You have to pass in arguments to functions that are declared like this. That's with just parentheses, right? But if I were to add curly brackets, this automatically makes our the arguments of this function to be optional. That is, you can choose to add arguments to it, or you can choose to not. So starting in recent data versions, before now, we could just add arguments like this without checking without adding a null check. But now to make this error go away while you're, let's look at what the error is saying so that you understand what I'm talking about. So first off, we're talking, let's ignore this error, we'll come back to it. So the next error says, the parameter name can't have a value of null because of its type, but the implicit default value is null. So right now, at the moment, these values are null. And due to what's the word? So to take out this error, we have to add a null check to it. And adding a null check, simply you add a question mark before right after the data type declaration, you add a question mark. This just pretty much means this in short form pretty much means that this value is what's the word? This in long form just means if this value is null, return null, in a sense. Like it's just informing the compiler that it's possible that this value that is assigned to this value here can be null, or it can be assigned a value. But if it's null, it's like doing if name equal to null, return null, in a sense, right? So anytime we print, if we do not assign values to this, anytime we print name and age, it's going to give us null in the console. So because we have declared our arguments as being optional, we can actually take out these arguments. And I mean, these values, and we're not going to get an error. But when we print this, we would see null for each of the variables inside in the console. So they're both null right now. Another advantage of using curly brackets is that you can assign a default value. You can assign a default value to your arguments. So instead of adding this null check, we could easily just give it a default value of, say, if no argument is passed, then we want to make sure that this value is never null and it should print Abbie at any point. So if I do not assign a value to name when we call our function, then the default value for name is always going to be Abbie. So if I were to run this, we see that the initial or the default value for name is Abbie and age is still null because we haven't assigned a default value to it. So that's one advantage of using this optional arguments rather. And we could also do the same for age, give it a default value of 50. And when we run the code, we would see that each of them would print appropriately. So we have name for Abbie, we have Abbie for name and 50 for age. Now, if we were to assign an actual value and we don't want to use the default value, for example, like when we call this function, we want to give it the proper value that we want for each of the arguments, then since it's optional, we have to first off call the name of the arguments and then assign it a value. Same for age. We get to call the name of the arguments and then assign it a value. Another thing is, this is unlike what's it called? Unlike positional arguments, you could call each of the arguments in this. When it's optional, you can call each of the arguments in any way that you want. You could call name first, you could call age first. It doesn't look at the position, and that's simply because each of the arguments is being called by its name and then assigned a value to it. So you could call them at any point. If we add more arguments to this, we could call age first and the last one first, or whichever way we want to call each of the arguments. It's not going to shout at us. It's still going to properly assign the value that we're giving to it to each of the arguments. So if I were to run the code now, we're expecting that the new values that we've assigned to the function would override the default value. The default value is just to make sure that at any point, if there's no value that's assigned to our function, it's not going to return null. It's just going to return, in the case where we do not want a null value to be returned, we can just assign a default value that would be displayed to the user or to be displayed when we do not have values assigned to our function. But when immediately we do have values assigned, then it's going to override our default values. Are we together? Okay, awesome. So this is for cases where okay, great. Thank you for responding. This is for, this same principle applies to any way in which you get to declare your functions, right? So you could also, in this case, use the equal to and the right angle brackets to declare variables like this. Say maybe you just want to print the user's name, oops, the user's name. Wait, what am I doing? Is this correct? The user's name is name and age is age. And so we get to see the values that were assigned to each of these arguments, right? So it's printing the right thing here. The user's name is Sheyi and the age is 30, just the way we assigned it here. Okay. Most of the things that we're using in our functions, we have already covered them in previous office hours. So there's no need explaining why we have a $sign here or why we decided to add this slash here. Okay, maybe I should explain this. So there are two ways in which you can declare a string. You either use single quotes or you use double quotes. Both of them are right. I just prefer declare my strings with a single quote. Now, the thing that just happened here is, since I already have this string declared using single quotes, I can't use this character inside of my string without escaping it. So escaping it just means to telling the compiler to overlook this character, that no, this is not the end of the string. It's just a character that I want to use within the string, right? Because, okay, if I were to take out that, you'd see that our string starts here and it ends here. And then it totally ignores everything else that we have going on here down to the last quote. But adding the escape character just tells the compiler that this is not a quote. This is just a character that I want to use within the string, so ignore it and move on to the next thing. But if I were to declare, in this case, my string using double quotes, we're not going to have that problem because we declare the string using double quotes, and double quotes are different from single quotes, but we cannot have a double quote and single quote. We cannot have a double quote and single quote as a way to declare a string. It's either you use double quotes or you use single quotes, right? So in this case, this is not going to trigger any error because we declared our string using double quotes. But if I were to want maybe use double quotes inside here, you know how we quote things, right? In this case, it's going to break because we have declared our string using double quotes. And so for us to use this, we need to escape each of the quotes inside of our string. Oops. We need to escape each of the quotes inside of our string because in this case, we're using double quotes as we're using double quotes to declare the string. So if we run it, it's still going to be the same. The only difference is users is going to be in double quotes, like so. So how you declare a string will determine the kind of characters that you can use. Now, if I were to declare this using single quotes, I could easily avoid escaping this, but I would need to definitely escape this character right here, and it's going to return the same value. I just thought to mention that. I can't remember why. Okay, yeah. When I said there's no need to go back to this, I just thought it's best to explain what we have going on here. Okay. I was going to talk about another way in which we can declare a function, and that is by assigning a data type to that function. So for example, we want a function print the name. It takes in an argument of name. Now, one thing about declaring a variable with a function with a data type is, in this case, we can actually return a value. We can return a value, yes. So but how do I explain that? See, this error is very it's something that you'd most likely see often when you declare a function without adding a body, especially one where, if we declared this with void, we're not going to see this error. But because we've assigned it a data type, we see that one, it says that the body might complete normally, causing null to be returned, but the return type string is a potentially null value. So at this moment, when our function is null, like it's expecting a value to be returned from this function, and we have presently do not have anything going on. So it is null, and it's always going to throw an error in our DAT code. Even if I were to return a print statement, this is not what it's expecting. It's still expecting a string in this case. So it says the value of type void can be returned from the function printer name because it has a return type of string. So it's expecting a string to be returned from this function. So this would not fly. But if I were to do this, this is going to clear all our problems because the arguments that we passed into this function is a string. And okay, this means to return. Like this is a short form of returning something off of our string, off of our functions, right? This simply means return. The longer form would be to do this, to use the return keyword. And this is pretty much the same thing as having this short form here. So because in this example, I'm returning just one value. I don't have any manipulation going on inside of my code. I can easily just use the short form and return name. So what we can use this for is, say, we have a print statement and we say the second user is, so we can call this function here using our $, of course. And because there are like multiple things going on, in this case, we're going to need curly brackets so that we can assign a value to this. Let's use Escoda. And then we close it off with a semicolon. And when we click run, we see the second user is Escoda rather. What I mean here is, sorry, Escoda is one of participants of the mobile track, and I see him a lot in our YouTube channel, so I thought to use him as an example. So yeah, I just thought to mention that. Now, what we have going on here is the value of this string is always going to be whatever is returned from, the value of this function is always going to be what is returned. If I should switch this to being a plain string of name and I run the code, even though I've assigned this a value, because I am returning name from this function, it's always going to be name, even though I pass in anything inside of it. It's always going to be name because this is the value that was returned from the function. But if I were to switch this up to being the whatever value is assigned to this argument, then that's when we get to see the different values that we're assigning to this function. So since it's returning a string, we can easily just pass it into our string like so. And whatever value is returned from it is what will be displayed in the console as we see. Another way we can also declare our variable as ints, int age, and then we pass the int age into it. Here we cannot return a string, just as we've already established that whatever data type you assign to your function is what you're expecting to return from it. So it's expecting an int, but and in this case, we want it to return whatever value is assigned to this function. So if we print, so we have print an age. This is a positional argument, so it's essential that we pass it a value. So if we were to give it a value of 24 and we run, we're going to have 24 in the console because that's the value that is returned from this function. And whenever you call a function and assign it a value like so, if it's expecting a value, it's going to return whatever we stated for it to return inside of the function. If I have, just like I explained before, if I have 40, if I return 40, even though I'm passing an argument of 24, it's always going to return 40 because that's the value we're returning here. If we want to return age times 5, so it means whatever value that we pass in here will be multiplied by 5 and then return to us. So when we run this, we're supposed to see the value of 24 multiplied by 5. We're going to give this 3. We're expecting what 15 in the console. So whatever value we return of our function is what is going to be given back to us. Okay, so this is these are different ways in which we can declare functions, and we also talked about the different ways in which we can pass arguments to our functions. I'm hoping that you have not been confused through our discussion so far. Can someone please confirm that everyone is like we're all together? Okay, I see a question here. How come you define the function before or below after calling it? I'm not sure I understand that question. How come you define the function below after calling it? No, I do not understand the question. If you could please rephrase very quickly before we call today, before we close our session for today, I would appreciate that. But for now, please confirm that what we talked about functions today is pretty clear and it's going to make doing the task for the week easier. Okay, all right, great. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining today's office hour. Tomorrow, or when is our next session? Yeah, tomorrow. I'm going to yeah, we'll definitely have something else to talk about. I define my function after calling it. Do you mean that I'm still very confused. Very, very confused with the question. The function print details you used print after the return. Yes, exactly. I did that. I did explain that if you have just one thing going on inside of your function, you have just one thing that's being done, it's best to just keep it short and simple by using this short form of returning a value in your function. Just use this instead so that it keeps your, I mean, we could easily just have this and it's still going to be the same thing, but we just have one thing going on. We could also easily do this. And it's still going to be the same thing. We're still going to get the same values, but it's just one thing, instead of having to, like right now, we just used 3 lines in our code simply to return the argument of this function, when we could also just use the short form and we get to have our code in just one line, right? So, and it's still going to give us the same thing. I just thought to give you the different, it's just best to mention it's good to keep your code as short as possible if you can. In the case where you can, it's good to keep your code as short as possible. Okay, I think. Oh, I get your point now. I get your point now. So all these functions are called, I declared the functions outside of the main method. So it's as though, okay, even though we have them here in our file body, if it's known that we have these functions, but it's only valid when it's called within the main method. If I were to cut this and paste here, then we would have the problem that you're talking about, because in this case, we're calling the function according to the space. Local variable print details can be referenced before it is declared. Now, this is where we would have the issue that you're talking about, because we declared the function here, then we're calling it all the way here. So if we want that error to go away, then we would have to call the function after it's been declared, and you see that we have no issues. But that's if they're within a block, right? All these functions were called outside of the main method, so they're just pretty much hanging around. They only become valid, they only follow the rules when we call them inside of a particular block of code. So if we were to do the same for this function and we called it before it is being declared, then we're going to have that error, and it would only pass after we call it. It will only pass when we call it after it is being declared. I hope that answers your question. Is how do you take input in Dart and print output? That's pretty much all we have done in this session. We pretty much declared functions that were expecting inputs, and we assigned values to them when the functions were called. That's pretty much input outputs. That's what we just did right now. Okay, so we have covered quite a number of things. So on your own, please do well to review the office hour again. If functions are still a bit confusing to you, review this office hour again, test around on that pad. That pad is there for you to play around with. Just don't play around to the point where you get to crash your computer. I remember someone during the last week, I think, with the loop task, the person ran a loop that refused to end. So his system was hanging. So except in situations like that, you have that pad to play around with as much as you want, just to ensure that you keep practicing. The more you practice, the more you strengthen your hand on each of these concepts, each of these features of that. Just keep playing around with these things. Give yourself basic tasks to just anything that pops up in your head that you think it would be a good way to learn a certain concept, do it. Keep playing around. If you have questions relating to this week, to this week's materials, then do well to post on Slack and I'll answer the question as well. You could also ask a question on the LMS and I'll do well to answer when I can. How do you request? I'm not sure that is valid for any of the tasks that you'd be working on through this Dart phase. Like while we're still talking about that, there is no way in which you would there is no task that requires you to prompt a user to put in an input. So it's really not valid for any of the tasks or anything that we are going to be talking about for the first 4 weeks, I think, or 5 weeks when we're still talking about that. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining today's office hour. Do well to use the form in the case where you have a question. I'm only reading through the comment section because we're talking about certain details and I just want to be sure that we're all following along. But for the most part, I think as we keep adjusting, I'm going to look less at the comment section, except when I want to be sure that we're all following along. But yeah, please make use of the form. That said, thank you all so much for joining today's office hour. I'll see you all tomorrow. I think it's the same time. Okay, no, I'll see you all tomorrow at 1 p.m.